You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
Today I'm joined by Kyle McCoy. He's an ultra runner who in recent years has been focused on multi-stage race events, such as those held by the Four Deserts Race Series. In our discussion, we talk about the Four Deserts Race Series and his upcoming race in Antarctica. I hope you enjoy it. So why don't we start off with a little bit about your background in running. How did you get started in running, and what was the catalyst to start running at the ultra distances and multi-day races?
Yeah, so I grew up in Oklahoma, and I was always it was always kind of my strongest sport. My dad was a public school teacher, and he coached about every sport imaginable, and he was a runner himself. And I think he kind of had aspirations of me being a football player, being from Oklahoma, not a surprise. But I was a runner, and I found myself drawn to it. I was relatively strong at it, and in those days, this was kind of the high school age. I was running, that meant cross country and track, and so I'd run the mile, the 2 mile, and then in cross country I'd run the 5K, and those were kind of in those days, considered long races, and they were for that age. And then I went on to college. I was on an ROTC scholarship, so I didn't have a lot of extra time, but I did run still quite a bit in college. I was running on occasion with the collegiate cross country and track team for fun, for training. And then, so 4 years of college, and then I'm an Army officer, fast forward to 2001. And I was commissioned as an officer in May 11th, 2001. Little did I know what was coming. Found myself in Afghanistan four times over the subsequent 4 years, so not a lot of time for running. But I can remember even in Afghanistan, I'd be on a forward operating base kind of in the middle of nowhere on the Pakistani border, and I would run around the perimeter, and we would have these challenges where we would run kind of distances and try to stay fit. And I got out of the Army and was in graduate school at that point, and I started to run some more. But really, what launched my running in terms of ultra running, interest was in 2007. I ran the New York City Marathon, and I knew I could run distances, but this was a new distance, obviously, for me. I trained, quite a bit, and I was able to do relatively well. I ran a 3:09 for that first marathon, and I thought, I felt like I wanted to die. But, that after about a week, as they say, most people, they change their mindset pretty quickly. And of course, I started thinking, wow, I want to try going farther. And so that's really, I think, what led to my launching into this ultra running. So from that point, just as a snapshot, I ran a 50 kilometer, which is kind of I consider kind of a gateway drug to ultra running. It's a 31 mile race, and then built up to a 50 miler, and then 100 kilometers, and then 100 miler, and then at the extreme end out here on the spectrum of ultra running, I ran my first multi-day ultra marathon stage race in Morocco in 2010 in a race called the Marathon des Sables. So that was my, since then I've ran many more ultras, but that was how it kind of built up into ultra running.
So I imagine you would recommend for those interested in getting into ultra running to kind of do that progression to, definitely do some marathons first and then slowly ramp it up and not go for like 100 miler straight out of the gate. Would you say that's a good approach?
I think that's a good approach. I think, there are anomalies. I've seen friends out there, that could kind of jump right into a 100 miler from a marathon. And to some extent, being naive is valuable in coming into some of these races, because, you get too far in and you realize, wow, I'm too far now to turn back, and you just kind of suffer through it. But the preferred route is to build up And I say at least get a 50 miler under your belt before trying a 100 miler.
So you mentioned you were in the military. Do you think the military training helps with the mental side of ultra running in terms of the training that you went through and just sort of how you approach things out there when you're competing?
I do. I think it has a big impact, and you're just put under circumstances and stresses that you don't otherwise, I think, endure in normal life. And to some extent, so much of these races is psychology and how can you handle the mental state when times are really bad. And to the extent you can draw upon previous experiences where you've suffered, you think, well, I've been here and I've gotten through it. It wasn't not a fun experience, but I'm going to get through it again. And I had gone through, I was in the Army's Ranger Regiment, which requires all members go through Ranger school. And so I did a particularly acute sufferfest in Ranger school, which is effectively kind of 63 days of very little sleep, 2 meals a day, and a lot of stress. So I knew that, if I could get through that, I could get through one of these races that, last maybe a day or two.
For the listeners who don't know your background, you're not a professional runner, you have a day job. So how do you balance the training load that's required to do these multi-day endurance races with the rest of, you've got a family, you've got a job. How do you go about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. The reality is I'm still figuring it out, but the majority of the miles I run, the bulk of them are done on the weekend, really Saturday, Sunday, long runs, oftentimes back to back. So it's not uncommon to do, an 18 mile, a 20 mile back to back on Saturday, Sunday, or a marathon, half marathon back to back. So that's really where, as long as you're getting in those long runs once a week and you have a strong base, fitness, then I think you'll be okay. I also don't like to make an excuse of it. I know there are runners that are far stronger than myself that also have day jobs, some of which are just near pro level, and that's always shocking to me. But the way I typically train is in the mornings before work. I've always been a morning person, so I'll run. I'm in Seattle, so it's dark and rainy, but I'll run before work and then go to work. And if I'm on a real particularly high mileage week, then it could be a 2-a-day. So I'll do a run in the evening after getting home. But the reality is the bulk of the miles occur on the weekend.
Let's switch gears and talk about the 4 Deserts race series. So you've raced in 3 of their 4 desert races, and your 4th is coming up in Antarctica in a few weeks. Would you just explain to us that race format and that race series for those not familiar with it?
Sure. And then explaining it, I'm going to back up just to my first stage race, desert stage race, which was in 2010, which was not part of the 4 deserts, but it's important. I'd read about, I think it was Time Magazine and National Geographic. They published a couple of rankings of the world's toughest foot races, and Marathon des Sables and or the 4 Deserts race series are both in there. And so that's what drew me to it initially. But they're both the same format. Marathon des Sables in Morocco has about 1,100 to 1,200 competitors. The French host the race. Hence the name Marathon des Sables, which just means Marathon of Sands. And it's a 7-day stage race, self-supported through the desert, through kind of the worst conditions you can imagine. And, effectively you're going from point A to point B each day over 7 days. It's actually 6 stages, and your total distance is about 250 kilometers, 155 miles. And, the long stage is typically day 4 or 5, which is about a 50 miler. And the rest are in the range of 20 to 26 miles, with the last day being about a 10 kilometer total distance. So 4 deserts is the same format. The deserts are in the Atacama Desert in Chile, and then you have the Gobi Desert in China, and then you have the Sahara Desert, which was previously hosted in Egypt, and because of some logistical issues, they've moved it recently to Namibia. And then lastly, you have Antarctica, which is somewhat counterintuitive, but it's actually a desert itself as measured by rainfall. It's all frozen. So that's kind of the format.
So, you're talking about races that are a multi-day and ultimately 155 miles or so, and under harsh conditions. So it's not just like going out and doing something in pristine conditions. You're dealing with what I would imagine in deserts would be temperature fluctuations, storms, unexpected conditions. So how do you kind of prepare and deal with that scenario, especially in Seattle, where the weather there is unpredictable, but it tends to be on the rainier, cloudier side sometimes, and you're not dealing with extreme temperatures and things like that. So how do you deal with that? And from a training perspective, what did you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. That the reality is it's obvious 3 of the 4 races, the 4 desert races are very hot. And those of us in the 4 deserts club, or soon to be in the club, which means we've finished all 4, we kind of become intimately familiar with what are the real difficulties of each race. And so I think this kind of captures that. It's helpful to explain it a little bit. The Atacama Desert in Chile, North Chile, is the highest desert in the world. So you're dealing with kind of altitude of 8,000 feet plus for much of the race. And it's obviously quite hot, but the key there is it's high. It's a high altitude course, which is a bit counterintuitive. And then in Namibia, which was previously the Sahara Desert, and in the Marathon de Sable, it was the Sahara Desert. That's typically considered the hottest desert in the world. So when I was running through it, it was exceeding 120 degrees at points during the course. So obviously there is heat training, as is for all these, but in particular in that one. The Gobi Desert in China is really unique in that the biggest component of the race is that the temperature is so volatile. And to give you a sense, on day 1 of that stage race, it literally snowed on us. It was below 32 degrees. And on day 5, the temperature was north of 115 degrees. So the volatility in that desert is really off the charts. And so what that means is you have to carry more gear. Antarctica is the obvious exception in that it's a cold weather race, and so you have to prepare for the cold weather. To the core of your question and preparing, for these races, there's actually been a lot of research done on heat training, and the human body can adapt to heat relatively well with about 3 weeks of preparation. And what that means is you just need to expose your body, for 3 weeks on a consistent basis, day after day, to heat. And so what I do is by the way, the military has done the majority of the research on this, but what I do is I sit in a sauna as I'm leading up to these races in the hot weather for upwards to 45 minutes. On occasion, I hit like 50 minutes, but the bulk of the time, I wouldn't exceed 45 minutes. And, you're sitting in these saunas, which are, north of 150, sometimes 160 degrees, I would set it at. And so your body just adapts with that. The other thing is, you just have to train as you run a race, which is I'm carrying 10 to 15 pounds. And so I'm running with my backpack on just like I will wearing 10 to 15 pounds. So on a big week, I'm doing 60 or 70 miles. And ultra runners may say, well, that's not that much in the grand scheme of things. But then I remind them, well, carry 15 pounds for that distance, and it changes that math pretty quickly.
Right. So from a gear perspective, you're required to carry everything from point A to point B through the entire race, including your nutrition. Is that correct?
Yeah, I should have expanded on that earlier. I said self-supported, and that's exactly what that means. You're carrying between, you start each race for those that you have to be obsessive about the weight you're carrying, and I say like ultra obsessive to the point where you're, cutting off the handle of your toothbrush just to trim it down. And so I would start each race with about 15 pounds, which includes all of the required gear, my sleeping bag, sleeping pad, and clothing and food for a 7-day period.
Wow. So, that's amazing. So from a nutrition perspective, that's something that no matter what distance sport you compete in is something that it has to go under consideration. But when you're dealing with multi-day, I would imagine it's really, important, but you're also talking about weight limits. So what is your kind of thinking or approach to nutrition when you have to carry it all for multi-days and just dealing with the conditions and the various things that you have in front of you in a desert scenario?
Yeah, and this is the toughest aspect of these races for me. I still haven't figured out the solution, but a couple of things to point out. One is you're required to carry 2,000 calories per day. So if you think about that, you're carrying 14,000 calories over a 7-day period. As we all know, 2,000 calories is nowhere near enough when you're running these distances and burning the calories that you do. But it's a kind of a vicious cycle. The more calories you carry, the more weight you carry, the more calories you burn. And so what I ended up doing was carrying usually around 2,200 to 2,300 calories per day over that 7-day period. And an average day looks like a hot, a freeze-dried oatmeal for the morning or granola. That's kind of my breakfast. And these tend to be high caloric density meals, so high calorie per weight ratio. And then during the run itself, the big thing is just, diversity. And so I carry, things like Kind bars. I carry, gels, but not a lot of them because you can only stomach so much in the heat. For me, I carry, nuts, almond butter. Almond butter is packed in calories, and those are some of the things. And then during the evening, I will have one very large, 700-800 calorie freeze-dried dinner, and so that really is what makes up the bulk of my meals.
Take a step back for a second. You mentioned the Atacama Desert and how it's one of the highest in the world, or the highest in the world, averaging over 8,000 feet. I live at sea level, and I know Seattle's the same on the coast. How do you deal or train with altitude when you're not living there? Because that's a problem. I'm based in New York City, and people here who want to go into mountain trail races and things like that have to deal with. What were your considerations when approaching a race with high altitude like that?
Yeah, the big thing for me was there's really no way to do it without going to that altitude, and the only way you can simulate the altitude is actually there are some chambers, that you can purchase to actually sleep in or train in. But I wasn't willing to pay the money for that. So in short, I wasn't able to train to the extent you would like to train for that type of altitude. But that said, there are mountains here in Seattle, and I would go to run in the mountains, on the weekends on occasion and get some of that exposure, but still not getting anywhere necessary.
Right. So since another aspect of any endurance race or anyone training for an endurance race, but especially when you're racing in a multi-day event, recovery plays a huge role. How do you address recovery when you're in a race that's multi-day and you have to be ready the next morning to get up and go? I mean, did you do anything special in the evenings or anything in your training to address that? Or are there any tools or techniques that you would recommend?
The best thing to do for these types of races is to run, because effectively what you're doing is running back-to-back marathons day after day. And so I say the way to train for that is to do just that. And so, if, I'm kind of a 250, 251, a low 250 marathoner at my best. But I've always been decent at running, kind of at 90% day one and then 90% day two. And so for whatever reason, I think most of that's just a result of actually trying it out there on my own. And so if you're training, you got to train like the race in terms of, and that's going to prepare you more than anything for the race, by the way. But in terms of the best, recovery during the race itself, I have a very specific routine I go through, which is when I finish each stage, I'll come into the tent area. These are kind of encampments at various points along the course, the race out in the desert, and I will immediately stock up on water. The one thing that they do provide is water, and I will go to my tent, put my legs up in the air, elevate my legs, and I'll immediately begin drinking. For me, a recovery drink. There are lots of them out there. My preferred drink is Hammer Nutrition's Recoverite, and that seems to work really well for me. And so, I will effectively kind of lie there for a while, loosen up as much as possible, and then get up and walk around. And that seems to be what works for me the best.
Yeah, I could second the Recoverite. I actually use that myself on almost a daily basis. Love that stuff. I personally like the vanilla flavor, but they're all pretty good. So,
strawberry is my favorite.
I'll have to try that one. So, really quickly, just walk me back through to one of your desert races and tell me a time, if there is one, that something really unexpected happened, whether it's the conditions or something in the race. Just kind of help me visualize what it is that someone can encounter in one of these races.
Oh wow, there are so many things, and I always tell people that are asking me about the races, and some of whom have gone on to do them. You have to kind of expect the unexpected, and that's part of the the beauty of these races. Over 7 days, so much can happen. You're in arguably the most hostile environments in the world, outside of being in like a combat zone. And so, you just have to prepare for that, for the worst, and kind of be flexible. I guess the biggest example for me would be the Gobi Desert in China, which is northwest China near the Mongolian border. Two things happened during that race, which were unexpected. One was it snowed on us, like I mentioned. It does get down pretty cold in the desert at night, but this was midday. It had been below 32 degrees, and I was absolutely freezing in the desert. And then the other thing is, toward the end of the race, we were hit by a sandstorm, and this was a monster sandstorm. We were in our this was just prior to the final day of the race, which was only going to be about a 10K, and everyone was relaxing in the camp. Luckily, we weren't out on the course, but this monster sandstorm just sort of came through and lingered over for about 3.5 hours. And as a result of that, so much equipment was damaged, and people were kind of so strung out that the race directors canceled the last day, unfortunately. So the race was effectively over at that point. And so that's just a couple of examples. Wow.
Yeah, that's really makes it interesting and truly like an adventure. You never know what you're going to face. So I guess that leads us to Antarctica, which is your fourth desert race and one that's coming up in a few weeks. As I was researching for this, I read a little bit about the race, and it talked about potential gale force blizzards, temperatures below zero, unpredictable weather, things that, when we think of Antarctica, that's exactly what we think about. So both mentally and physically, what have you been doing in the run up to this race that's either different or maybe it's the same as the other ones to prepare for what ultimately, Antarctica is probably the harshest place on Earth, I would imagine. So, how have you gone about preparing for this specific upcoming race?
Yeah, cold weather obviously has its own set of challenges. Just to give you some background, I've done two ultra cold weather marathons historically. One in the northern Canada, Yukon territory, called the Yukon Arctic Ultra, which to this day and probably for my entire life will be the coldest race I've ever done. It was at one point -40, which, for those listening, is where Fahrenheit and Celsius match up, -40. So it doesn't matter if you say Fahrenheit or Celsius, but it was extraordinarily cold, and that was a 100-mile race all at once. Took me about 26 hours, And then I've done the Iditarod Trail Invitational in Alaska, and it didn't get that cold. It was down kind of in the 15 degree, maybe 10 degree plus Fahrenheit range overnight, but that was 130 miles all at once. And so I have some experience with the cold, but this race, you hit the nail on the head. There's so many factors related to Antarctica. What I've learned is that, in my own research of it as well, is that the race director accounts for about 8 possible days of racing, but typically 2 of those days are canceled, and that's predominantly for wind, and the wind can be really severe there. The format is that we get off the boat each day. We take a research vessel from the southern tip of South America, from Ushuaia, and we land on Antarctica, and we get off each day, get on the mainland and run. And it's very difficult to get all the runners off and on the boat if the winds are high. And also, we've got to be prepared to stay on shore in the event of severe winds and a whiteout. So we all come on shore prepared to stay for like 24 hours. So how to prepare? I'm not doing anything differently, to be honest with you. I'm still running with my backpack with 15 pounds or so, which I'll carry on the race. I am obviously wearing different set of clothing. And the biggest danger in cold weather is you don't want to sweat and then automatically, and then quickly stop. That's your worst friend. So try to manage your sweat, and, which effectively means when you start out, you're cold, and then you're going to warm up, but you should start out being pretty cold, and then you want to manage that throughout the day.
Yeah, I guess that's a good lesson for everybody, and including myself when I'm winter running, is you don't want to go outside to start your run and feel really warm and comfortable, because midway through your run, you're going to be sweating, and then you're going to get freezing when you stop. So I think that's really, really good advice, which is what you're saying is you should actually feel a little cold as you start out, and then obviously as your body warms up, you'll kind of get to that comfort level. Is that what you're saying?
That's it. And it sounds easy when we all say it, but as we all know, it's hard to do in reality. I'm also not a big fan of standing around, as we often do at starting line of races for many, many, minutes or maybe even an hour shivering, because that takes so much more energy than we realize it. So the best thing to do is to layer up, be warm. Once you start moving, shed as much as you possibly can until you're cold. And then, you should warm up from that point. Got it.
So for this Antarctica race, you're actually raising money for a charity. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. And in each of these races, I found that I think people enjoy, I send daily updates throughout the race. My wife's been really helpful with me, and she's way better than I am at fundraising for nonprofits. But I found that people, I think they kind of come along for the ride and the experience. And if you're like me, and I know you are, Adam, I just love to go along for these experiences and read about them and hear about them. And so I think folks are the same, and that I'm reaching out to. And I found that they also are open to, they say, well, if this guy's crazy enough to do this ridiculous race, I'll throw a few bucks to that nonprofit. So over the course of these 4 races, I've raised some money for various nonprofits, veterans causes. I'm big into land conservation and parks, and so those are the other areas. And so right now, I'm raising money for Seattle Parks Foundation. I'm obviously in Seattle, and we're going big since it's my last 4 deserts race. In that we're targeting $100,000, and we've got some pretty good corporate sponsors on board. Brooks Running, which is a Seattle-based company, that has donated money, and a couple of venture capital funds out here. So right now we're at about $53,000. So we're over halfway, and I find that the race starts next a week from this Sunday. So in about 9 days from now, and I find that people, once the race starts, there's kind of a big jump in donations as people kind of follow along during the race. But thanks for asking.
So if a listener wants to either track you or look at the charity raise, how would they go about doing that? Do you have a website, or should they go to Facebook, or what would you recommend?
I do, thank you. And so the best way to track the race itself is to go to the website 4deserts, the number 4deserts.com, and then you'll see the last desert, which is what will be occurring. 4Deserts is really good at maintaining that website on a real-time basis in terms of the leaders. There will be about 60 of us competing in this race. My goal, as a side note, is to try to finish in the top 3. But in terms of, so that's the best way to track the race. In terms of the nonprofit, I've set up a CrowdRise website, and if you just go to CrowdRise and you search Kyle Antarctica, then you'll see my website.
Okay, and I'll also add those links to the blog post on my website related to this when I post it later when we produce this. So if listeners want to find that, they can go there and easily click on it. So we're almost out of time. I guess let's end with one final question. And although I know you don't want to look ahead of Antarctica, and I know you're focused on that. I mean, what is your plans going into the future from an endurance perspective? What will you be focused on after you finish this 4 deserts odyssey? I guess you would say. What is next on your plate? What are you visualizing?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of repeating these big races, and so to your point, I will be done with the 4 Desert series. But the good news is that the company itself they realize that fact, and so they now do roving races, and so every year they do one new location. And so next year in November, about a year from now, I will compete in the 4 Deserts roving race, which will be in Patagonia. So I won't be going too far from this Antarctica race. Unfortunately, that race is already full, but you can look out to the next 4 Deserts roving race in 2018. And then in February of next year, so earlier, I have one big race planned, and that's to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to do a fat tire mountain bike race on the Iditarod Trail. It's called the Iditarod Trail Invitational, which I previously mentioned. I did it on foot over 130 miles. This time I will travel 350 miles. It's in February, so it's kind of out there in no man's land, and that's really a raw race in that you have to completely navigate and be self-sufficient throughout the race for that 350 miles. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So Kyle, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for sharing some of these really interesting stories, and best of luck in Antarctica. I know I'll be tracking, and I'm sure the listeners will be tracking and looking for those updates and things. So good luck, and maybe in the future we can get an update post Antarctica to hear a little bit more about how it went.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media, and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.